Thanks, everyone. I guess the pressure's off to make this an earth-shaking panel. So love for panelists to introduce themselves. We have just some really fantastic executives here. Why don't we start with Colleen?
Hi, I'm Colleen McCreary. I'm the Chief People, Places, and Publicity Officer at Credit Karma, which is the largest financial platform serving about 120 million members, helping people make financial progress.
Hi, I'm Kristen Gall. I'm the president of Rakuten Rewards. We are a shopping loyalty program that rewards shoppers with cashback at about 3,500 different retailers across the country.
Hi, I'm Zoe Hart. I'm the Chief People Officer for Upwork, the world's work marketplace.
I'm Allison Levitsky, reporter for Protocol. I've written a lot about workplace issues over the last year, and that used to largely focus around this kind of return to office, hybrid work, future of work question, and it still does, but it's really shifted. I think about a year or so ago, I started a return to office tracker, where I was kind of charting and constantly updating every time a tech company would come out and say, we're going to the office June 1st, August 1st, so and it kept getting pushed back, and after a while, I just kind of stopped updating it because these dates started to be so meaningless. The companies weren't really putting them out anymore. So this whole paradigm is really evolving, and just in talking with the panelists, it's clear that different organizations are really taking very different approaches, have different philosophies. So love to hear from each of you what hybrid looks like for you, or how your organization is approaching the future of work. Maybe we can start at the other end with Zoe.
Sure, thank you. Well, Upwork is founded on the belief that people can connect and do great work no matter where they are on the planet. And so for us, we had always been partially distributed. We had people in 180 countries, around the world, working with us before COVID happened and everything sort of changed overnight. But from here, what we've been doing is we did talk a lot about how to use our offices, but we have really decided that we're going to be a remote-first company. Everybody can work from where they need to work. We want our offices to be a space of collaboration, innovation, and intentional gathering versus somewhere people are obliged to go 2 or 3 days a week because their manager said so. And so for us, we're doing that. We've had to. Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. We've sublet one of our offices. We are in consideration set about others. If anybody would like any real estate, please talk to me. But we have these opportunities to really bring people together and make it intentional and about impact versus I need you here because we own this space.
So we are a little bit different. I think actually the cool thing about this panel is we have a very diverse set of perspectives up here, which it'll be very nice for us to just discuss pros and cons of each. So Rakuten is actually a really large Japanese e-commerce company. You may not be familiar with it. It's called the Amazon of Japan. We've got about 4,000 employees in the US that work for Rakuten Americas. Rakuten Rewards is a subsidiary of that. We've got about 1,000 employees. We're distributed across about 8 offices in the US. Before the pandemic, we were actually a little bit hybrid and very flexible before because we had to be on screens, even in the offices that we were in, because we have so many employees in so many different places. So during the pandemic, it was relatively easy for us to slide into fully remote. We did, however, decide as we went back out of the pandemic that we would attempt to do a bit of a pilot, which was what we called an activity-based return to office. Mm-hmm. An activity-based was you come back to the office when there is a critical activity that we feel that teams need to be in person for. That worked-ish. And I say that it worked-ish in that there were definitely some teams that came back and had a very vibrant in-office team experience. And to this day, our marketing team and the teams that live under me continue to work in the space where a couple days a week they come back together and they do those critical activities together. For a lot of other teams, that didn't work really well. So we did a bit of a reset after that pilot to determine what our concrete go-forward policy was going to be. Right now, the policy is as of January 1st, teams are going to be in the office 3 days a week. And the way that we are creating that sort of paradigm is 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, are what we consider to be anchor days. Teams are together in the office all at once, all at the same time. And then to create a little bit more flexibility, we have a day that's sort of a floating day, depending on when you want to come in, or what is easier from a flexibility perspective. So that's generally the paradigm that we're creating in January. Additionally, in order to create a little bit more flexibility for our teams, we do have what we consider to be flex work. So if you want to come in early and leave early, depending on your schedule, you can do that. As well as work from anywhere July, which is you can literally work from anywhere in July, anywhere in the world, provided you can kind of deal with the time differences. And our employees are responding really well to that thing as well. So I can't tell you how that is going to roll out because we haven't done it yet. I will say the other piece of that is that we will allow employees to be able to apply to be remote. And that application will be considered based on where their team is their team all back in person, is their team really distributed, do they work aggressively cross-functionally with other teams, or do they do their work in a more remote fashion. So it's going to be interesting to see sort of how many people apply to be remote. I think we have a lot of work to do on then what is the paradigm from a real estate perspective that you then create based on that. But that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah. So I think we are actually in between both of you, which is kind of interesting. And I think even early on, I had sort of thrown out that hybrid wasn't really the correct word. I thought flexible was a way better word. I think hybrid sort of implies that there are a certain number of days and you have to be there that many days. I also think it's a little bit of a misnomer relative to depending on the industry that you're in. Like tech has had remote workers for a really long time. They've had people who've always been super flexible. I mean, I was talking with someone earlier and I mentioned that even in my career, 22 years ago, I was a remote employee at Microsoft. Like I worked remotely from a team that I went and saw every couple of weeks. And I actually decided at that point I didn't like it. I actually missed being around humans, which might work with the role that I'm in. It's probably good that I like to be around people. But our culture, and I think this is a lot of who you are and maybe how you decide what model works best, is really developed around relationships. Mm-hmm. And we said that from the day that we sent people home, in our case in early March 2020, we said, hey, you're coming back in some form. And it didn't matter how many people said, oh, well, look at what Facebook's doing, or look at the startup's doing, or look at what Google's doing. We just like, hey, relationships matter. It's important to us. We want those relationships. But we also wanted to embrace the flexibility of, if we said you have to come in these days and your kid has soccer on those days, that maybe those days don't work for you as much. And we've allowed every team to decide you have to come back to the office a couple of days a week. Yeah. It actually turns out it's very challenging for employees when you don't give them the rules or the structure. We actually see this backlash around well, how many days does that really mean? And we said, hey, every team needs to solve for that. What we find is engineering tends to come back 1 to 2 days, and then sort of the other parts of our workforce tend to come back around 3 days, but it's super flexible. And we've really driven on that. I think a lot of companies, because they put a foot in both boxes, are struggling more and more. Agreed. What I think is great right now, though, is that there is actually a range of options for employees to choose from when it comes to working for someone. And I think what we see in the media a lot right now is that, well, this is the best way or this is the only way. I think, people who want to be remote forever are very much on that camp and they want to push that camp. And then you have these other people on this other side who are like, no, you have to be in the office all the time, camp. And the reality is like, this is just giving people more choices in terms of how they work best and where they will work best. And I think that's the skill that we've been talking with employees over time, is to identify for themselves as well and be able to articulate to their managers and to their teams, this is how I work best and why. Right. Because I think making the assumption that everybody is going to be successful remote or everybody's going to be successful in the office and depending on where you are in your life and your career, isn't really that awesome of an experience. And so for us, that platform of, hey, we're very clear about you are going to be expected to be in an office. We don't want a fully remote workforce. We are clear on the context of the relationships and why they matter. And we're also clear on if this is not for you, we're okay if you decide you want to work somewhere else. And we are very active about that message of like, this is who we are, this is how we want to operate. And we also recognize that you have a choice in terms of what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I hear 3 different takes within the hybrid, under the hybrid umbrella. So maybe the title question, is there an expiration date on hybrid work? Maybe we could do a rapid fire, does anyone think that there is an expiration date?
No.
No.
I mean, I think this is the new normal, and this world where we will continue to be fluid as workers is going to be a really interesting one. And I think, Colleen, you make a really good point. I think we feel the same way, which is we're going to put a stake in the ground and say this is the way that we want to work. And if that works for you, then amazing. If it doesn't work for you, there are tons of other models out there that may. And what we really do want is we want workers that sort of align with our values and that align with the way that we want to do things. And ultimately, we are going to be more successful as a company in sort of generating that level of, of fit, I think.
I do think there's a conversation. We all work in sort of this knowledge worker scenario where it's very easy or easier. I mean, it's still hard, but it's easier than, I think if you're in manufacturing or you're in medical services or, public service or certain aspects of things that are tangible or there's an actual service, retail, those kinds of things, like it's a much harder conversation for those companies to have. And then what is the equitable policy? I was reading about General Motors and the choices that they are making. I mean, they're actually the people who make their product have had to be on the line since I think it was like 8 weeks into COVID. They had to get back to work and get cars out. But their sort of non-manufacturing workforce was able to work from home. And what did that create? And are there inequities in that situation? And I think that that's a much harder conversation for those companies. I mean, I'm actually really glad I don't have to have that conversation. But I do think there is something to be said for if this is your business and this is what your customers are doing, is there an inequity around that? So, maybe in our worlds, there isn't necessarily an expiration date. But I think there might be other industries where there really could be an expiration.
Yeah. And I mean, even within knowledge work, I think there are inequities in that, and you've kind of got to think through, proximity bias and how this affects people, women versus men versus, all kinds of, diversity. I'd love to hear from maybe Zoe, how are you all thinking through kind of, building that into the way that you work?
Yeah, well, I think like both of them have said, I think this is about flexibility and also being clear about expectations. Because if the company isn't clear about what success looks like, then the employees don't know if they're being successful. And so it's this arbitrary, well, how many days is the right amount of days? Is it like 2, wink, wink, nudge, nudge? Is it the 2 when the CEO is there, right? And how does that part work? And so I think being very clear about that matters a lot. For us, what we found is when our leaders are empathetic and they're speaking from a place of clarity and expectation setting, it's much easier for our teams to be successful. And so that meant, hey, this is a video on meeting. The other 6 that you have this week are not. And that's okay. Walk around the block, fold laundry, take your dog around the block, whatever needs to lot around the block. But really think about what matters, because to your point, we had, for example, in some of our more junior team members are 3-4 deep to an apartment because it's still really expensive to live in a lot of these cities. And so, while maybe your VP has got this beautiful office backdrop and they're like crouched by a bed or at the kitchen table, what does that do? How does that maybe diminish their credibility in a perception situation? And so we want to make sure that we're really being explicit about what the expectations are, what does that look like, and how do we do this? And this is really something where it isn't the future, and it's not even the past, because I think most of us have worked at some point either for an international conglomerate or something where I wasn't in the same office as my colleagues. So it's not new, but this is how we work now, and that's not going to change. And so companies have got to be able to show up for their team members if they want the best talent.
Yeah. Kristen, what about you? How is Rakuten kind of thinking through the proximity bias issue with hybrid?
I think, I think it's something that we have talked about a lot, and, we just had a conversation about this today, which proximity bias is very real. And I think as we determine who will be remote and who will not be remote in this paradigm, I think we have to be very careful to figure out what that looks like and what the composition of each of those groups are. For instance, if more working moms are applying to be remote, that may be an issue when we have a lot of people in the office, getting the FaceTime and getting the attention and getting a lot of sort of informal time with our executives. That could be something that could impact their careers going forward. That's one example, but there is a lot of equity that we have to be very, very painfully aware of, because if we're not, this could sort of perpetuate things in the future that we didn't really intend for it to perpetuate, but that it does. So I think it's something that we're going to pay really close attention to as we move into this space, because it's something we care about so much. And I really want to make sure that this doesn't end up ultimately impacting people in a way that, you know, we really never intended to sort of build it that way.
Yeah. Anything from you on that, Colleen?
I think it has a lot to do with whatever systems and tools you've built in your processes for, you know, compensation and promotions and recognition and feedback, and how are those set up, which are basically the same systems that you have to look at inherently across everything. And it, you know, making changes to those systems are actually very challenging for companies. I think we throw that out there a lot as like, oh, we'll just change how you pay, or just change how you promote people, or, you know, sort of just, you know, do we have clarity even, you know, before there was remote work? I think that a lot of people would say, I don't get the feedback that I want to get around my career. I don't know why that person was promoted and I wasn't promoted. So, you know, all of these are kind of sitting out there, and this is just another layer that you have to filter into all of those systems and tools, and how you're developing them, and then, you know, sort of how are you actually living them in practice.
Yeah, we were just hearing about your office in Oakland. I mean, just office space itself is such a big question mark, I think, for a lot of organizations right now. What changes has Credit Karma made to its real estate footprint?
Well, we had a little bit of an advantage that we were planning to move both in Oakland and Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where we have the majority of our employees already pre-COVID. And then we actually, during COVID, were renovating these spaces, brand new spaces as well. So we had a little bit of an advantage ahead of time of knowing like, hey, we already wanted people to be working together more and creating more sort of soft spaces that people felt like they could move around. I also think, though, if you are a company, and this is, you know, my position where we are, which is if you're going to require people to come to the office, they should have their own space as well. And so people feel like they do have a desk, or they can, you know, sort of establish their zone. But we wanted this healthy balance. We also, you know, you really had to invest in the IT infrastructure, right? Maybe as you're using Google Meet or Zoom or Teams or whatever it is, you know, people, if they're coming in, if they want it to be better than it was at home, to your note of 4 people living in an apartment, like it better be that conference room is set up and ready to go. We also, though, I think, really wanted to make sure, and we've always been this way, but that there were places that people wanted to be at. And so, you know, we have all of our offices have a coffee bar. That's free, and you know, but that space is way bigger than we had in our previous office spaces, knowing that people were likely going to have those spontaneous moments and use it. And we actually find that that's true. Like when people are coming in, they are using that time to spend the time together and hanging out on couches, or on, you know, we're lucky to be in mostly sunny areas on the roof, or in that space where they are gathering, and less, you know, kind of sitting in their own space with their headphones on and staring at a screen, which is, I think, what people were really trying to get away from.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking with Kristen about the ways that Rakuten Rewards is using offices, and it sounded like kind of a mix there of people were coming in to do heads down work in addition to the more collaborative. So maybe you could share a little there.
Yeah, so we did a pretty extensive survey of our employees after we had started this activity-based pilot, and it was really interesting to see how different people responded to different questions in that survey. And one of the questions that we asked is, what do you use the office for? You would think, I use the office for collaboration, I use the office to go meet with my teams. Actually, 60%-ish of them were using the office to come and have a quiet place to work. And I can relate. I have small children at home. I love my small children, but they often ask for snacks, and it's very quiet and calm in my office. So I think that there is this component of, how do you make the office mean what people need it to mean for them? And I think that that's a really important thing that we're thinking about as we move forward. We may do some office consolidation, but I think, to your point, that gathering space becomes even more important. We were very tech-enabled before the pandemic because we have a distributed office network. So we were really good at big Zoom screens, and the technology was already there. But I think it's making sure that number one, you make it easy for people to come into offices. So we're paying for transit, and we are doing, some lifestyle benefits that allow people to come into offices in an easier fashion. But then when they are there, what are you sort of fostering, and how are you creating collaboration between people, but also to give them space? We have a lot of sort of quiet telephone booth kind of spaces where if someone needs to go and take a call, they want to be by themselves, they can. So that we are really looking at, yes, we are answering all of the ways in which people want to use offices, because they do want to collaborate.
Yeah.
But they also need to leave that apartment with 4 roommates where they, are
100%.
sharing a bedroom with someone. And we actually did have a lot of people that struggled with that during the pandemic. I either live by myself in a studio and I need to be around other humans, or I share a 2-bedroom with 4 other people and I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So
during the pandemic, just to build off that, we had a program called Candle in the Window, which was about being able to say, I need to work somewhere differently than home. And for me, that was, and for our company, that was for people in situations like that, where like, it's too hectic here, I need to go to a WeWork, or home isn't a safe space for me every time, or there are all these other issues. And so it allowed us to have an anonymous way for us just to help lift people up in a time when most people were working at home as well. And so I think you're right, there are all these different needs, and we, our company is comprised, every company is comprised of people who have individual stories and need different things. It's very hard to create a space that works perfectly for every person. And so every one of these companies is trying to create flexibility and a space for people to gather and to work, silently when they need to, and in a team when they need to as well. And I think that's the commonality, even though the approaches are different.
Yeah, I think that's a big point, which is it gets lost in the narrative of everything has to be either this way or that way. And I think you're finding even in this, there's a lot of gray here of every, there are these different shades of how these things work out. But I think society-wise, there'd been this narrative building that it has to be one side or the other. And I thought it was the leadership's job to build that empathy for other people. We had a lot of questions about opening offices, even when we weren't requiring people to come back to them. But the fact that we had realized that there were these people who were really struggling for multiple reasons on their own, and they needed a space to go to, and we felt like that was our obligation to those people. But having to bring the story along to all of your employees to bring out of, pull out of this polarity between sort of factions, I would say, and this narrative that had been building, I think, more externally than even internally, was actually, that storytelling was really important in the journey.
Yeah, especially as a very flexible company. How does Upwork, have you guys let go of any real estate? Are you scaling back at all?
We did, and I think you spoke to my boss, our CEO, Hayden Brown, at the beginning of the pandemic. We had just moved into a beautiful office space in Santa Clara. We had been there for a few months when, March 6th, we closed our offices in 2020 for like 2 weeks, and we'll be right back. And,
of course.
of course. My poor plants, my good chocolate, all the things I hide from my kids were left there. But so we did sublease that, and we've reopened our offices in both Chicago and San Francisco. We sublet half the space in San Francisco, and we're really just trying to assess, again, what is it our team wants? And it's for people who are in California, down in the South Bay, that's still a big drive up to San Francisco. And so how can we do that in a way that fosters the innovation and collaboration without this feeling of obligation and I have to? And so just trying to really do that. And for us, the biggest framing that has been impactful has been around having it be, your success at the company is determined by your impact to the business and the furthering of our mission and the way you treat our customers. And so if you do that really well in an office space, wonderful, please come to the office. If you prefer not to, great. And to your point, people are in different seasons of their lives, and what works now may not work in 3 months or 2 years. And it tends to be that the people who are making these decisions are often more likely grouped in a certain life stage than all the other employees in the organization, and it's our job to remember that.
Yeah. I think all these approaches have their pros and cons, and there's things that are difficult about all of them. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What is the biggest challenge of the way that you're approaching hybrid now? Maybe start with Colleen.
Yeah, I think we deal with the chatter of people who would like to be remote forever, and that it really isn't an option for us. And educating people initially was exceptionally painful. You know, we don't have any salespeople at our company, so we were not set up to have employees in every state, or, you know, people don't have visas to go work in every other country, which I think is also sort of lost in a lot of, especially the early narrative of like, you can just go work from wherever and it's no big deal. And you're like, yeah, you don't have a visa to actually work there. We're not set up for you. And, you know, in our business where, you know, we're working with people's financial data in particular, and security is our number one priority as a company, like we already had a lot of rules about where you could take your laptop and work from. But explaining that's longer than a tweet is really challenging for people. I mean, really challenging. And we unfortunately had to set up systems to catch people doing that because the liability was so high as an organization. So, you know, we sort of navigated that. I will say, we have had people who've left because they wanted to go work from Montana, or they want to go work from Argentina, or wherever it is, and we've just said like, hey, that's a choice. I will also say though, we actually as a company have had the lowest attrition we've had in our 14-year history. Lowest voluntary, I mean, really, really low. And I think some of that was just the clarity that we gave from the very beginning. You are coming back. We're expecting you to come back. If you don't want to come back, that's okay. You can leave. That's fine. We always call it the graceful goodbye, regardless of why. And so I think, you know, having clarity and at least a point of view and drawing a line in the sand actually has helped, and it has helped guide those decisions of like, this is the way it is or it's not. So it gave people the ownership and the choice, and they knew what they were choosing between.
Yeah. What about you, Kristen? What's been the most challenging?
There's so many things that are challenging about this. I think this has been one of the most challenging leadership conversations that we've ever had as an organization, and we've been having it for so long. I think you know, from our end, and this is, you know, more me speaking to the challenges as it stands leading through it, is creating a paradigm of what it means to be hybrid with an onus on in-office, but also the world of we are creating a little bit more flexibility on remote. It makes it really, really difficult to create consistency. And I think that this is going to be the biggest, most challenging thing that we work through over the next few months is for those people that do apply to be remote. Not all of them will be approved. What does that mean?
Right.
Yes.
How does that impact them? How are you creating equity in the world of who gets approved, who doesn't get approved? There's a lot of, you know, are you critical talent? Do you work really aggressively with a cross-functional team? Or are you, to your point, are you a salesperson who lives in, you know, wants to sort of work remotely because it's like, I just manage my accounts. I'm not doing any of the things that involve cross-functional. So I think for us, that's the thing that I will say causes me the most angst and keeps me up at night right now, is just the equity of doing that. What we are trying to do very aggressively right now is work with our C-suite, because our C-suite ultimately is the keeper of the approvals. How is our C-suite consistent? How are we creating a consistent paradigm of who gets approved, who doesn't get approved, and what it looks like? This is a sticky one, and we knew going into it that it would be. And I think consistency to me is the key. I don't want to have one person on my C-suite be super, super lenient, say yes to everyone, and then another person isn't, and then that seeming inequity really causes a lot of friction and a lot of heartache for a lot of people. I want this to be an experience where it's, here are the lines that we've drawn as a team, here is what's important to us, and then here is generally how this will play out amongst the organization, because inconsistency is really, I think, what ruins things. I really applaud what you've done, which is that level of consistency of this is how it is. It's helpful, right? And it does sort of clear up all of that internal angst of, well, will we or won't we?
Right. I think Brené Brown says that, right?
Yes.
That clarity is kindness.
Absolutely.
Ladies, we're getting some questions in Slido. This is fascinating.
Maybe we could just
Slido.
finish this.
Keeping the theme around metaverse, right? Someone is asking.
Can we go to Zoe on this question and then hear the questions? Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Okay. So I think for us, just following on that, communication is the greatest challenge in making sure that everybody is hearing the same message and internalizing the same message. And we definitely have, and I think nowhere is this more prevalent perhaps than in HR, because it's been a rough couple of years to be in HR. But I think just the communication and making sure that people are internalizing that, and people feeling like I've communicated this 4 different ways. And somebody's like, but I don't get it. And you're like, okay, so let's talk about it again. Let's talk about it in a different way in every single medium, and really, really reminding our leaders that you are going to need to communicate 5, 6x as many times as you think you should have to communicate for a message to be internalized.
Yeah.
All right. So again, just want to get the audience involved. and
Great, love it.
Take advantage
Bring
of your
it, love it.
expertise, right? So in keeping the theme around metaverse, someone's posing the question, would a metaverse-based virtual office be the way forward? Why or why not?
Weirdly, we have had people meet in the metaverse
Yeah.
recently.
Really?
Like it is,
So
it's
tell-
actually happening. It
so
blew
tell
my
us
mind a little
about that.
bit.
Yeah, how's that?
I don't know that it is like it is not like running rampant through our organization, but we do have people who are using Meta headsets and they're meeting together in a virtual office. It's going to be a slow ramp up of that, right? Like I do actually think that that is something that, in the world where everyone is remote has a lot of potential in the future. I don't think it replaces in person. I don't think it replaces the energy, and I don't think it replaces the sort of amazing collaboration that can happen when you have two people sort of brainstorming and looking at each other's eyeballs at a table.
Yeah.
But I do think that there will be a use for it in the future, for sure. I think the technology is clunky right now, and it's not great, and I don't like to use it. So as it gets more and more sophisticated and as the technology improves, I think it's an option.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're going to go invest in it right this second.
Yeah, I think, if you look at, I worked in video games for a long time earlier in my career, and, I think a lot of people right now are looking at what Second Life had done with, Linden Labs, who built that, and what that environment was. And I remember being in Second Life and having tried to
Me
do this
too.
at a company years ago, and, I think there were a lot of things that there was, security, certainly,
Yeah, sure.
safety, sort of personal safety around all of that, and then sort of how you show up in that world and what does that mean, and how you display yourself in that world.
Yeah.
And do you want your professional world and your personal world to be colliding in that way? I think we're seeing some of that in the conversations now when you're sort of in somebody's home, and what does that look like. But I think to Kristen's note, I think the technology solution of really being totally present and not have the uncanny valley from a technology perspective of this is fake and this isn't real. And then, just from the hardware at the moment, it's just not, I don't think it's really conducive to many people wanting to spend the number of hours that you do. I mean, right now we're all sort of over Zoomed anyway. Can you imagine with sort of extra glasses on or a headset? I mean, that to me just feels so, and I mean, I use an Oculus headset. It's now an older version with my son, and I have an expiration date on how long I can play before I'm like, all right, I'm out. Like, I'm sweating behind this. Like, this is not my thing.
Hurts my head.
Yeah. What about at Upwork? I mean,
We had a couple of staff meetings, of CEO staff meetings in the metaverse with varying success, candidly. A lot of us knocking stuff over on our desks, was a big, I knocked, because it takes some getting used to. But similarly, when I talked to, my dad, who was a CEO for many years, about doing a lot of our work over Zoom, he didn't live that way, right? He also didn't have to work, all the time because he didn't have a device. And so things change, and I can imagine that my children, who are much more comfortable in that world and have friendships with people online that they haven't met IRL, are going to be more comfortable with that. So I think I may just be a little bit on the dinosaur side of that one.
Yeah. So another question, sort of a meta question, not Meta, the formerly known as Facebook. Pete Bellamy wants to know, isn't the issue more about trust? So do companies trust employees to work virtually forever? I think sort of an ancillary question is around, measuring performance and at the end of the day, what kind of, you're doing what you're expected to do when it's due at the level of quality expected. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I just cut you off. Go.
I was just going to say, I think it goes back to my point on the systems and tools that you use within your company, right? And so I think everybody's on a different end of that spectrum. We got rid of performance reviews years ago, so that's not something we do. We do role-based pay, which means that everybody who's in the same job gets paid the exact same thing. We don't do merit increases. We do a market review twice a year. We do promotions 4 times a year. We're very clear on a job framework that, so you know what is expected of you and what the, sort of the clarity of that. We use a weekly real-time feedback system between managers and employees, but we removed a lot of discretionary tools like the no merit increases, and most jobs don't have bonuses and those kinds of things. So we provided the certainty around employment, but also the clarity around what we expect from you in your role and your job. And I think, again, those are the systems and tools that we're using. So, it's less about not trusting you and more about the relationship we want you to have in terms of product development and how work gets done.
Yeah,
but
clarity around expectations.
I
key,
think it's
right?
the same thing regardless of, any of these conversations, right? Like, how well does the employee understand what is expected of them, and what are the programs or systems and tools that are connected to the recognition or support or lack thereof of that work.
I think as a leader, if you're bringing people back to the office because you don't trust them, it will not go well for you.
Right.
We're bringing people back to the office because we like being around each other and we like that collaboration, not because we don't trust them and not because we think that they can't do well remotely, because they have done an amazing job over the last couple of years. And I trust them implicitly to do that job. I think it's less that, and I agree, it's systems and tools and how you are managing and monitoring both in person as well as people who are remote. And I think that level of equity between the two becomes even more important because you have created a level playing field with the systems.
Yeah, and I think too there's this misnomer that we all drove to the office and worked for 9.5 hours and never took a coffee break, and I never talked to you about Real Housewives, or like none of that stuff ever happened, right? And I was just heads down the entire time, and then I came home, and now I'm at home, and there's all kinds of distraction, and it's just it's this whole thing that Colleen has been saying about like this forced comparison and this polarized narrative of us versus them. It's the worker versus the company. Most companies don't work that way anymore. We've outgrown that. It's an outdated model. I mean, we've seen so many more people freelancing, so many more people taking control of their own lives. 70+% of managers are much more open to remote work than they were before the pandemic. And we see, 36% of the population is now, in America, is now freelancing in some capacity. So things have changed, but not to, it's a great story if you're us versus them. They don't trust you. You've got to go back. No, that's not what anybody is saying.
Well, and I think those employers who are in that zone are
separate
losing. I mean,
issue.
you can look at it. Those employers are losing people, and it doesn't matter if you are an hourly worker working somewhere or you're a high-end executive. If you're not giving people the opportunity to sort of do the work that they want to do in the way that they want to do it, what the nice part right now is there really are options for people and choices, and they are literally using their feet to do that.
Yeah, and the best businesses know that team members, be they freelance or employees, do their best work when they're engaged, when they're motivated, when they're inspired, when they believe in what they're doing for their customers.
Absolutely.
And so these things are around that, but they're not the center of why somebody is doing an exceptional job or not.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm going to turn it over to you. We're just about out of time. Allison, to wrap up.
Allison, you're in your last moments.
Yeah, 37 seconds. Any other audience questions? Anyone want to shout anything out or?
This person right here.
Yeah, over there.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Great conversation. I'm interested in what impact this might have on employee productivity, on your ability to make decisions together. When some people are hybrid or remote and other people are in the office, how do decisions get made?
Yeah, I think all of us have said that most of us have had multiple offices and people spread out across this office. I mean, before I was at Credit Karma, the other company I worked at, we literally had our management team was San Francisco, New York, and London. So we were always across these time zones, and we were having to solve for that even pre-hybrid work or those kinds of things. And I think from an employee to management perspective, the tools and the development of those tools, as much as I might hate Slack on many a days, like our all hands meetings are now all hands sort of wherever you are, and people are commenting in multiple channels that you're trying to manage. But I do feel that people are much more willing, and maybe that is the value of the screen, is to maybe ask some of the harder questions that you are going to have to grapple with, and then as a team have to decide what the answers are to.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think we try and be very careful about if you are at home that you are not at a disadvantage, that we don't have the conversation just in the room.
Right.
And we're distributed too, so we don't have that problem as much because we typically do have people in 3 different locations or 4 different locations. But it does require a little bit more training, a little bit more conversation around what is the new etiquette of you've got people at home, people in the room. how do you create a paradigm that works where they have voices, you have voices, and you're not just having a conversation amongst yourselves?
I think we should probably cut it off just because we're over time, but
David, you want to
thank
ask
you.
one more question? I
Yeah.
want to give David a chance.
Yeah.
Can you stand up, David, and so we can hear you?
I'm not sure this question has an answer. But the decisions we made before, which resulted in all of us coming into offices, were made based on a certain set of assumptions about who we are as people and what the hierarchy is and who gets to make the decisions. And what I hear here is a lot of discovery of all kinds of assumptions other than that one that were spawned off of it. And so the other question is, what are the other decisions that we're still living under that were made and we didn't discover them yet, that are creating all kinds of limitations on our ability to innovate, our ability to fix problems in the world, our ability to make progress around things like climate change, and getting cross-country transmission lines approved per Mr. Gates and his conference in Seattle. I mean, there's still a whole bunch of limitations where certain things have been said and done, and everybody's agreed to go along with it. So what are those other things besides coming into the office?
I mean, I would say that one of the biggest things is who's making the decisions, who's in the room. And if it's a group of people who all look the same, then you're not uncovering the truth of the world. And that's a big problem. And that's, I think, one of the things that happened here in COVID was a lot more people were involved in conversations because democratizing of opportunity to connect with each other via Slack, via clear daisies around who the approver was or whatever that was. So I would say that many of the things we have yet to discover, we need to discover with a more diverse and inclusive group of people in the decision and conversation to start with, because there are a lot of problems a lot of us don't know from our own privilege.
Equity, equity, equity. Like, I mean, it is the next frontier of the work that we do, is just how important that conversation is, and we have not even scratched the surface yet in so many ways.
I think the other piece too is the openness to taking shots and challenging the systems. And we've obviously been very focused on very developed worlds right now in the conversation that we're having. We're not having and we're four white women up here talking about it, so they're like not lost on that. But I do think this is where, continuing to invest in startups and letting people take shots, and who gets to take those shots, and where is that innovation stemming from? And, sort of, do we have sort of political systems where people are participating and actually can have a voice in those systems that are, determining policy? I mean, I just sent an email to my whole company on Sunday saying, hey, there are two big V's right now I'm focused on. One is you need to go vote, because we're a business around the financial system, which is all, regulated by governments, local, state, and national. And it doesn't matter what country you're in. And then vaccines, which I think is also an equitable, from a health and safety requirement and necessary for your community to exist. So there's a lot of different systems and components, but it's whether or not people are funded and also willing and supported to take shots that haven't been taken before.
Yeah. So ladies, we've come to the end. What a wonderful conversation. Allison, Zoe, Colleen, Kristen, thank you so much. And let's continue this. Yeah, how about a hand for the ladies in the panel?